So today we have Jeff Gavlinski. He's used to throwing a bit bigger party than this. I think the last one he threw in Denver, the conference, was 3,000 people, you said? Oh no, Mike. He needs Mike. I was glad that we tested that out.
This is working. No, you're confusing my event with Gary's. So my event had 600 and some odd people.
600, not too shabby, out in Colorado. And for ISPs that may be used to working with technical equipment, Jeff is with Plume. So you may know that VP, right, of Plume?
Yes. Yeah, I'm the global vice president of Telecom and Wireless Association for Plume Design.
He doesn't sleep either running both of those programs. So he is going to run our program today. I'm going to turn this over to him and welcome our panel 3.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. It's been quite a great day, full of great content and great speakers. As she talked about, in my copious spare time, I run a broadband conference in Colorado called Mountain Connect. So I've been running this conference for almost 9 years now. And actually it's kind of fitting because how the conference started, I didn't start the conference. Actually, it was started by another individual who saw a need around our BTOP grant that we got back in 2009 in Colorado. And our BTOP grant was to connect all of our school districts in Colorado. And Mountain Connect was then formed to discuss our BTOP grant and its impact to the western slope of Colorado, which typically is where the most challenging areas are. So driving down here from Syracuse yesterday, I noticed a lot of similarities in terms of landscape. Not as high, but similarities nonetheless. And I, as you might guess, because we're effectively building a middle mile network around the state of Colorado, a lot of communities, rural communities, looked at that as an opportunity to build laterals once the network was built, because it was going to be fiber to connect their community. So at the time, I lived down in Durango, Colorado, which is down in the southwest corner, and I started Colorado's first local technology planning team. So we had it was based on our regional economic development footprint, and it was a very diverse, very rural area, 6 counties, multiple towns and cities, none bigger than 19,000 people. So this was going to have a major impact to our future down there in terms of economic development, growth, etc. But what ended up happening, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but what ended up happening is our grant ran out of funds. And you might say, how the heck did that happen? Well, I'll tell you how it happened. And it's one of the things that concerns me about all the federal funding programs that are coming out. Lack of oversight, underestimating construction costs. Because again, as I drove down here yesterday from Syracuse, one of the things I was thinking about was, I wonder where you have to bury fiber, what it's like to, do you have to bore through granite here? And I'm sure that you probably do. There's not a cheap way of doing that, and if you underestimate those construction costs, you are effectively going to run out of money. The other problem that we had that hopefully we will not have with the BEAD funding is overbuilding, where overbuilding doesn't need to occur, because that's taking money, again, away from where it's needed to put it someplace where it's also not needed, right? So taking it away from folks that need it to places where it's not necessary. So those were two big factors in terms of why we ran out of money in Colorado, and we ended up with a fixed wireless middle mile solution. So you can imagine all the time, effort, and emotion that went into planning for all these rural communities who had to sort of pivot away from all that effort, because it was a completely different solution. So somebody has to be a negative Nancy with regards to this, and I guess it's me. So anyways, I leave that as a lesson, I think, because one of the other contributing factor was lack of oversight. And I can't stress how important oversight is, because without oversight, these kind of things happen, are allowed to happen, and will impact can impact communities adversely. So we have a great panel, which I will introduce, and I'm going to ask everybody to answer one question as you introduce yourself, and that is, what keeps you up at night? What are you concerned about with respect to these funding programs and what the future holds? And so I'm gonna start with Chris Fisher, who's a partner at Cuddy and Fetter and board director, New York State Wireless Association. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Southern Tier 8 and Genetics for having us. Hopefully everybody had a great lunch. I don't know about you. I'm feeling a little full from all the fiber. I'm a wireless guy. I've been working in the wireless and mobile space for 28 years now. Upstate original Canandaigua, so just a little bit further over, but a Finger Lakes guy, and now I live downstate. Just by way of background, and as Jeff mentioned, a few of my colleagues are here. We founded New York State Wireless Association back in '07. Been very engaged at the state and local level, and myself as well, leading more recently on some projects downstate that deal with digital equity and inclusion, some wireless applications in that space, and I served on prior Governor Cuomo's task force for Upstate Cellular. So hopefully bring a little bit to the table today on some wireless solutions. What keeps me up at night with respect to where we're headed? There's a lot of funding, and it's not just BEAD. It's digital equity, it's BEAD, it's hopefully a 5G fund once we get some mapping. All that's going to come to play, and how is the state of New York going to, through its very capable broadband programming that it has, and Connect All, how's it going to leverage all that funding for the best use, the end use cases that meet the needs of people? And where are we going to do that? It's going to be fiber, it's going to be wireless, it's going to be a lot of different things. So a little bit just kind of temporally, where's Connect All going to go with all of that? And that's a question.
Thank you. So next we're going to go to Ali Mohammed, who is the Senior Director of Digital Innovation and Transformation, New York Power Authority. Welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you again, Jen, for inviting us over. So I am the Senior Director of Digital Innovation and Transformation. What does that mean? It's a long title. Anything with respect to technology and innovation goes to my department. So I oversee R&D, innovation, and digital transformation. So leading the digital strategy for NIPA as part of Vision 2020 and Vision 2030, the foundational infrastructure that we identified for us to build was fiber backbone. So we own almost 1,400 circuit miles of transmission infrastructure, out of which 700 miles of it is being deployed with fiber, OPGW, which is a ground wire with fiber within it. So it's an upgrade for us. It's a replacement of a kind for us and for our infrastructure, leveraging our existing right-of-ways. So when we looked at building a fiber, we started to build it for our internal needs first. But we had enough capacity to say, okay, is there a way for us to use that excess capacity to help our customers, which are the munis and co-ops? And in the Southern Tier region, we have almost 30 to 40% of our customers. By the way, we have munis and co-ops in all of New York, but 51 of them is the total number. Out of which 30 to 40% of them are in Southern Tier region and Erie counties, pretty close by. How can we help our customers build the critical infrastructure that they need to become digitized? Whether you're talking about smart grid applications, whether you're talking about smart cities, there's a lot of applications and use cases that we talked about today. How can we build that critical infrastructure needed to get there? I led that program for NIPA, and then in 2020, we also piloted a private wireless network. We flew a drone on private LTE with high definition video and thermal imaging, so we can closely monitor our assets without using manned inspections, aerial inspections. So So that also led us to say, how can we expand what we are building today to meet the needs of our future? And that's why we're taking the same approach for Connect All to say, yes, there is an opportunity from a funding perspective to address these needs, but how can we come up with innovative solutions to help those customers? One of them that we have on the panel is the Village of Sherburne, is get them prepared for the future. And that's what I'm leading at. There's 4 pilots that we're working on concurrently with a very stringent timeline. By end of September is what we have to complete these pilots by. Town of Nichols from Tioga County that Jen mentioned. We have 2 in upstate New York, St. Lawrence County and Lewis County. And the last one is the Village of Sherburne in Shenango County. So I'm leading these 4 initiatives now. Hopefully by the end of September, we'll have those homes connected. And sorry, I forgot to answer, what keeps me up at night, right? So as
Oh, you didn't answer
mentioned-
that?
No. I
After
did
all
not.
that?
No. What keeps me up at night is when you talked about, where does Connect All, bring to the table, right? Where it's gonna take us. For me is how can we provide that innovative solution, right? So 2 things that come to mind is reliability and affordability. Because without these 2, there's a lot of homes in upstate New York. The FCC maps and the New York State PSC maps came out. It talks about 27% of the homes are underserved or unserved completely. How can we bring broadband, affordable broadband, to those homes? Because in this digital era, broadband is not a luxury, it's a necessity. We saw that in the pandemic, so that's what we are working towards now.
Thank you. So I was told, no offense to my other panelists, to save the best for last. So it's my great pleasure to introduce William Acey.
I gotta use that mic.
Don't spit on it.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Again, my name is Bill Acey. Been a mayor and been involved with the Village of Sherburne since 1992, so I've been doing this a while. I tell people I had hair when I started, so. Got completely immersed in the public power side and tried to learn as much as I could about public power and electricity, and suddenly realized that we were mini NYSEGs, if you folks are on NYSEG or grid or a privately held electric utility, and learned pretty much everything we could learn about the electric utility. And in '94, I ran into a friend of mine, a colleague, who said he was going to run fiber in the village of Freeport. And I said, "You're going to run what?" And he said, "I'm going to run fiber." And he did. And he put up dark fiber. And ever since then, I've kind of had my eye on it, and thinking that, this is a good thing because, utilities are going to need fiber. They're going to need robust communications in the future. And for all the reasons that we've heard today and some others that you'll probably hear about in our panel. So in 2018, 2019, Frontier Communications filed bankruptcy reorganization under Chapter 11. And one of the things that had been holding us back in trying to pursue a fiber project was that they had a 350 employee office across the street from our electric department. So it was a little difficult to really build out anything against them. Their employees lived and worked with our employees and with our school, and it would have been an uphill battle to convince the public that they needed a public broadband system at the time. So, we've been kind of waiting for the right moment, and when they filed bankruptcy, we said this is the right moment because, they were not serving the areas outside of our village. Our electric department serves the village as well as the people outside the village and in the township, and we also serve 2 other small townships with electricity. So, people have been crying they couldn't get cable, they couldn't get, broadband, et cetera, for a long time. So 2018, 2019, we started to move forward on our project. And the goal was to build it over a 4-year period of time. We weren't really looking at this, COVID problem, and then all of a sudden COVID hit. And then people wanted it like yesterday. So we were kind of on our way with design. At the same time, our friends at the Power Authority, who we buy a good bunch of our electricity from, had come out with a strategic plan that they were going to digitize the New York Power Authority and make it a smart grid center. So I call it my 55-cent economic development plan. Wrote a letter to the Power Authority about a year and a half ago and said, hey, why don't you use us as your pilot to coordinate with your smart grid initiatives. They had supercomputers. We needed connectivity back to them, but at the same time, it seemed like it would be a fit because we are the distribution entity or the distribution utility. They're the wholesaler. They supply us some transmission along with some of the incumbent investor-owned utilities, but it just seemed to make sense to work with them. So as we looked into financing, we had applied for an earmark with our local congresswoman, and she awarded it to us, which opened us up to USDA funding. So we had one funding source, but anybody who's done, any of the other electeds here who have done a project with USDA, whether it be a sewer or water project, know that that's not a lot of fun. So, and we have done 2 sewer projects and 1 water project. So we looked for other sources of funding. We went to the local bank, and they offered us funding at 1% because they were sitting on all the ARPA money. So we had 2 sources, and we liked that one because no one was going to tell us what to do. We could do what we needed to do. And then all of a sudden, the Power Authority came back and responded to our letter and said, hey, how'd you like to be our pilot? And at the same time, we were awarded the Connect All funding, which was, you know, just more than you could ever imagine. So the stars kind of aligned for us, and we had our engineering done, we had our materials list ready, and we were ready to go. And as Ali can tell you, when they showed up, they said, you guys are ready to go. Yeah, we are. So, you know, the stars aligned, and we're building a project. We were going to try to deliver 1 gig of service to our customers for less than $50. I think we're going to get there. And now we're even looking at 10 gig because I saw a billboard that said Verizon's offering 10 gig. And I said, well, how hard is that? And with our system of open access, it's just a matter of changing a few components, and it's not as expensive as we thought it was going to be. So we're starting to look at 10 gig. In addition to that, you've all heard that the law has changed, that in 2035 there'll be no longer fossil fuel cars sold in New York State, and we need to manage our grid. So, you know, smart grid's real important to us, not to mention that, you know, we have goals as far as clean generation. So in order to meet those goals, we think that smart grid is going to be the best way to get to some of those goals. So I could go on for a lot longer, but I'll stop right there.
What keeps you up at night?
Oh, what keeps me up at night? A couple of things. One, regulation. I worry that the regulators are going to start telling us, you know, what we need to do and how we need to do it. It really worries me to think that right now we're relatively unregulated. We can do this. But the biggest issue I see is the supply chain because, you know, trying to get materials and get them at the right price is going to be a challenge going forward.
Thank you. And we can dive into that a little bit later as well. So here's my first question. I think when somebody wrote the title for this, they said to themselves, oh my God, we forgot 3 important topics, jammed them all into one session. So we're going to move in between all 3 unique topics. So my first question is for all the panelists. So as you know, the BEAT NOFO declared that unlicensed fixed wireless spectrum is an unreliable technology delivering broadband. Do you think that although states, by the way, just one other caveat, states can make an exception in some cases and utilize fixed wireless, do you think fixed wireless has a role? If so, why? And if not, why? Do you want to go first, Chris?
Sure. Short answer, yeah, I think fixed wireless has a role to play. Whether it's unlicensed or licensed, you're seeing a lot of actual movement in that space. A couple of the major mobile operators obviously have been focused on fixed wireless as part of their business plan. T-Mobile, by way of example, launched their product 5G to the home a year ago. They have 1 million subscribers. So how it plays out in New York, I think, is going to be a really interesting question. And where I see fixed wireless in New York, really coming back to Connect All, is in these really hard to reach areas where we're talking about low density population, high cost to build. There's a confluence both between the fiber and wireless side of the equation. How are we going to leverage money? I'll talk a little more about even mobile coverage, not just fixed wireless, but how can we build the backbone for that, both fiber and towers, get service to the community, both mobile, and does fixed wireless play a role there where, you know, you may have a few households that you may decide it's too expensive to get fiber to the home, but we can use it with a last mile solution with fixed wireless. So I absolutely think it should be part of the plan and the conversation. Clearly, from a overarching policy point of view, the NOFO says fiber first.
Yeah, so something else to think about. And I couldn't agree more with that, except that I'm not sure that the amount of money set aside is enough to build out the entire footprint of the U.S. And until we can do that, I think we have to consider that there are other technologies that are relevant. They're relevant until they're not relevant. And just to give you an example of cost, down in southwestern Colorado, I'm a little selfish talking about Colorado, that's where I live. Down in southwest Colorado, our Department of Transportation is connecting eastern Colorado to southwestern Colorado by finishing a fiber build over Wolf Creek Pass. It's a 24-mile build. It is $1 million a mile to build that. It has to be buried. It's boring through granite, and as I said earlier, boring through granite's not a cheap proposition. So I get a little concerned that we don't have enough money to cover those hard to reach areas that you were talking about.
Yeah, and just to look at it from maybe a hybridizing somewhat fixed wireless and mobile together, but the Upstate Task Force that I was on really looked at the mobile problem and took a look at 4G LTE, but obviously we're going to move to 5G. Cost was a big consideration, the low density issue,
Talk about that.
and where you get to cost per mile and cost of construction. It costs you $1 million to build a tower, and you got to bring fiber to it. What's the added cost in terms of fixed wireless for the community?
Just to add on to the cost, when we looked at Sherburne's model, and they did a phenomenal job with the planning that they've done over the years, the formula for identifying what a cost of the customer is broken down in 4 major categories, right? The first one is the middle mile cost to make sure we have the connectivity, the last mile cost, the O&M, and the ISP cost. So that dictates, what the overall cost for the customer would be. And when we looked at that model, we said, okay, if NIPA is supporting as part of the state program, is there an opportunity for us to possibly provide this middle mile capability at no cost to lower that, making it affordable. So that's where we said, okay, if we can help this, sure, why not? Let's take a look at what that price point would be. The second one was last mile. If Village of Sherburne receives the funding from the Connect All program, would that make that zero? So 2 of the major components of getting the cost down was brought down to 0. So the third component was O&M. With Village of Sherburne, it's a little different from the other projects that we're working on, is because the municipal electric department owns the poles. They're installing the fiber. They will maintain it. So it definitely drives the cost down because it's an incremental cost from an O&M perspective, adding that additional infrastructure. So that helped bring it down. Now the last point is the ISPs. Having that open access concept we heard from the previous panel too, is it drives competition. If you have a number of ISPs participating in that region, it definitely drives the cost down. If you have one, they have a monopoly. But definitely, we looked at that's for Village of Sherburne because we have 1,800 homes and businesses that are being connected in that village. But when we look at certain regions in upstate New York, where the topography might not even support building the fiber infrastructure out there, we have in one area, we have 6 houses in a mile that we're putting fiber to the home to. Can we justify the cost? Does it make sense for us to invest that in other regions? So we started to look at, okay, NIPA has a microwave tower that we built for our internal use. It's a 300, 400 foot tower, but it's barely used. So now we're looking at options to say, okay, if we can bring fiber to that tower and provide power and fiber to the major carriers, would it be easier to reach these homes via wireless solution? Might not be cost effective, might be cost effective, but that's an analysis we're doing for what happens if we are beyond this pilot. Well, how can we serve all the unserved regions first before going to underserved? So definitely fixed wireless definitely plays a role, but There's not a lot of funding out there. So looking at these innovative solutions, bringing the cost down, will help us save that money we can apply to other regions.
Just to piggyback a little bit off what Ali said is, yes, I do see wireless solutions, and we see it as integrating into our project as he just outlined. So I do see that. But the one thing about the whole fiber debate or wireless debate or internet or broadband debate that I find interesting is that your imagination has no bounds, because those towers that he's talking about, I mean, I look forward to thinking that once we really build out our infrastructure of fiber, which is going to happen, they probably won't need those towers anymore. We'll probably need something smaller, which will give us more efficient mesh networks, which will give us a more efficient cell network, which reduces latency. When we start talking about automatically controlled cars, driverless vehicles, those kinds of things, I think, the whole technology is going to change. And the one thing about this technology is that, we were going, wow, 1G, we're going to have 1G, and everybody else has, the best we could get was 100 megabytes. And now we're talking 10G, and we have just started building, like maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it's already changed the technology and what we're looking at. So the technology is going to change very, very fast. And so short answer is yes, I see wireless.
So sticking on that topic, I wonder what you all think about what T-Mobile is doing from a cellular fixed wireless perspective. By the mere fact that they're using licensed spectrum, do you think that'll take money away from places where we could actually build fiber?
So one thing it's a lessons learned for us, right? So when we looked at private LTE, the first thing that you need for private LTE is access to spectrum. 95% of the spectrum available today are owned by major carriers. So when NIPA looked at for 700 miles of our transmission infrastructure, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars just to get access to spectrum. Can that money be leveraged to build fiber to the homes, and you can build a small 5G network in that region? Sure, but spending hundreds of millions of dollars just so that you can have sub 1 gig spectrum available for transmission network doesn't make the business case. So we actually at a stage where we paused on our program to take a step back and say, okay, does this make sense? Can we justify spending the ratepayers' money on building an infrastructure that is to monitor our assets, which is very critical, but at what cost? So now we're looking at different options, but unlicensed spectrum is definitely not an option for us, because we do have critical infrastructure that we have to maintain. And from a cybersecurity perspective, for us, the only option is that looking at private licensed spectrum. So partnerships, whether it's public-public partnership or public-private partnerships, definitely help bring the cost down, because they have existing infrastructure that you can leverage. Yes, we will have to go through the checks and balances as an electric utility, whether we can or not use their infrastructure from a cyber perspective, but it definitely helps bring the cost down that can be leveraged by other regions for their needs as well.
I think I was more in alignment with where the mayor was headed as well, that I don't know that it's competitive as to the funding, but there's a lot of partnering that's got to go on in order to be able to get infrastructure built out. And I think about this conference and rural parts of New York, and we're just talking about no infrastructure. So we've got to get fiber there. We've got to get towers there. We should be looking at mobility as well, how that plays in the fixed wireless environment, and are they all additive into the same solutions for people who are looking for access? And access isn't just at the home, it's mobile as well. So I'm not sure it's competitive, it's inclusive. And what we really need is to have, again, coming back a little bit back to our state leadership, a facilitated conversation on that.
I'm going to pass on the question. The only thing I'm going to say is that whenever you innovate, there's always an Edsel.
There's always a what?
Edsel. It's a Edsel.
Very clever. I would never know that you were in politics. So, Chris, you served on a cellular task force in upstate New York. Can you explain to folks who might not have heard of this what that task force was tasked with? Sorry, I couldn't refuse. And what some of the findings were out of that task force, and what some of the barriers that you uncovered as a result of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I did serve on a task force with a number of other very bright and capable individuals. I was the industry guy in the room, so I always felt like I was outmatched and ungunned and coming in with ill-prepared to have these conversations. But the task force was a great cross-section of folks, Adirondacks, Catskills, certainly represented in the region here, state officials, put in the room, and the task really was see if you can come up with a plan on how we're going to solve the problem of mobile access in rural parts of the state. And really thinking about, when I think about the southern tier, that's part of the upstate mission we had. So Catskills and the Adirondacks, we did a lot of drive testing with some consultants on the street, wanted to essentially back test against what was the FCC data, which is now obviously being revised on mobile coverage. The goal at the end of the day was a deeper dive, which a lot of folks in this room already understand, but whether or not you have the collateral resources at a state level to say, what's the problem? Why is the mobile industry not building in these areas? And it really comes down to things that a lot of folks in this room know. Low population density, extraordinary topography and tree cover, which the laws of physics with wireless make it challenging, which means you need height, which means you need towers, generally speaking. And then you look at just existing infrastructure. Is there fiber even in these areas where we need fiber at the tower as well? And what's the cost? And the goal at the end of the day was, what would it take to fix that problem in New York, and what's the magnitude of it? And a few of the findings, and this was right before the pandemic. I think it's still relevant today, although you've seen continual incremental capital investment by the wireless carriers. There's not quite 2,000 miles of state roadway, which includes obviously we also studied county rural routes as well, that are not served, and that's about 11% of upstate New York, if you will, on roadway mileage. And the goal was to understand, just to solve the roadway mileage issue, what's it cost, and making some assessment of what population do you catch as well. So the methodology was roadway coverage. The short answer was, at least in the task force thinking, you get about 75% of the population in an area if you're solving the roadway coverage as well. The cost ended up being a mix of towers and in some strategic places, small cells, although you wouldn't normally think of that in rural. The cost ended up being somewhere around $300,000 of miles per mile of coverage. So that's the reverse of what does it cost to build in that mile. And trying to understand what's the statewide impact. The statewide impact was somewhere around, if you pumped in about $600 million, you could solve that problem. Where I sit at this moment in time is, that was 2 years ago. That report is still relevant today. We will get to a $9 billion FCC 5G fund, but what are we going to do in leveraging preparedness for that when we get there? And how much of this is not going to be, for lack of a better word, overbuilt, overlapped?
Right. Okay, so now we're going to pivot away from wireless and move to the second pillar of our session, which is utility poles, which I'm sure you are delighted about, because who doesn't like utility pole discussions? So, utilizing utility poles to deliver broadband obviously can reduce the cost of the overall project, and in some cases can make the project more efficient in terms of deployment. What I'm curious about is what's happening here in the state of New York. Now, I know the FCC is right now tackling pole attachment, pole replacement issues, but I wonder if the panel could talk about, especially Bill, since you're a municipal and utility, make-ready improvements. What is the state of New York doing with pole attachment issues and pole replacement issues?
Well, it's regulated, first of all. The pole attachment fees are regulated. It's a standardized formula. So the utilities can take their cost, and that's the only price that they can charge for the pole attachments. So it's a regulated area of broadband and fiber connections. But when we get into the make ready, one of the things that the last broadband funding did was it allowed the incumbent investor-owned utilities, again I'll pick on the IOUs like the NYSEGs and the grids, to receive funding for make-ready work. So as a public utility, we weren't receiving any of that funding. And again, a way of background, there's 47 village-owned or city-owned utilities in New York State, and there's 4 cooperative utilities in New York State. So there's 51 of us that are consumer-owned. We didn't receive any money from Make Ready at that point. And of course, when we did our advocacy in Washington, we made sure that our elected officials knew we weren't getting any money for Make Ready. And I mean, we were pretty vigilant at keeping our vegetation management up. We were keeping our poles, you know, in rotation. We had a pole replacement program. Most of us did a really good job at keeping our infrastructure in good shape, and consequently had lower outage rates. And of course, with the storms that we've had in the last, say, half a dozen years, it pretty much it shined a light on the lack of vegetation management and the lack of pole maintenance with the incumbents, so the investor owns. And our former governor was really picking on them a lot and fined them a lot with the Public Service Commission, and it was a big issue. So that kind of bothered us because they were getting money now to upgrade their poles and upgrade their hardware, and we got nothing. So that I felt was a flaw in the whole pole attachment arena. So, I mean, obviously I'm still a little sore about it, but it's something that we didn't receive any funding for. So that's what was going on, and it can continue to go on as well when we talk about funding outside of you know, in our case, we're a utility, we own our poles, but it can also, the pole attachment can be very expensive, and the make-ready work can be very expensive.
Yeah, on pole attachment, I think the wireless industry's had a long slog when it comes to working with the investor-owned utilities, just in the state of New York, because New York is a reverse preemption state, which essentially means the Public Service Commission regulates pole attachments in New York as compared to the FCC rules. And there's been a ton of activity over the years, obviously at the FCC, on a number of different things, one-touch, make-ready, all kinds of different policies. That takes some more time in New York, and the only reason why I'd say it's been a slog, I think the wireless industry, we only 5 years ago got the PSC, after I think 3 or 4 tries, to say the rates wireless carriers should be charged for small cell pole attachments should be consistent with wireline attachments. It had been essentially a unregulated, revenue-based analysis, which really made it difficult for the wireless industry to use that technology. Now, that may not be something that's a focus, obviously, in rural areas, but in other parts of New York, that was a real barrier and impediment to densifying wireless networks. Now, we've thankfully gotten past that. To a certain extent, there's still work in progress. I know the PC has a new proceeding open, so we'll see where that goes. But I think the PSC has really been focusing on that. So I would congratulate them on the last 4 or 5 years of taking a hard look at that, so that we don't just kind of focus on incumbencies, we focus on some new technologies and where there's some barriers to that.
I can take that really good because, you know, just to clarify, NIPA does not have any distribution lines. We only have generation and transmission. So talking about pole attachments is easy for me. One thing that we have noticed as part of this Connect All, you know, I'm part of the Utility Broadband Alliance, so definitely aware of all the pole attachment issues that we see nationwide. But when we look at Connect All initiative, one thing that we realize that these regions are underserved or completely unserved. So there's not a lot of incumbents on these poles today. Yes, the application is there's a lengthy process to go through, but once you work with the utilities, you know, you can streamline it as long as you prioritize what you're doing and what regions are you covering. The applications can be broken down into regions where there's less make-ready work. So one of the regions that we looked at in Tioga County is town of Nichols, which does not have a lot of infrastructure on these poles today. So which actually works to our benefit, so we can streamline that process for those regions. So definitely, you know, that is something that we are working with NISEC in this region and National Grid in upstate New York to identify those regions that have almost zero incumbents, because there's not a lot of make-ready work to do. And working with the co-owners is very important, because you have the application go from the utility pole owner, which is the utility, and then you have Verizon or Charter or Spectrum that also co-own that. So making sure you work with them definitely helps streamline the process. But we definitely saw that as one of the major risks for Connect All, as we have to meet the stringent deadline, is pole attachments.
So Bill, because you're a municipal utility, obviously you have access to your own poles. How does that benefit your deployment efforts? How does that benefit your ability not to run into the same issues that a traditional provider would run into?
Well, first and foremost, we don't have to ask for permission because we own it, so we can obviously get on it pretty quickly. We also are familiar with our poles, and one of the things about our project, we decided to put the fiber in the power band, not the comm band. The comm band is where you see your telephone lines and your internet and cable companies' lines, and so we're in the power band, so it makes it easier for us to work there because our linemen are certified to work in the power band, and then we're going to drop out of the power band into the comm band with our connections. So those are two things I can think of, and we know our system too. I mean, that's probably, we know our poles, we know what needs to be done, we inventory every pole, so we know what equipment's on every pole. From a design standpoint, if we need to know that we need to connect to a pole, we can pull it up on our screen and say, that's what's on that pole. Everything's there, all the hardware, everything is listed. So, in that way, it's easier.
Thank you. I'd love to continue talking about utility poles, but fortunately, somebody in the back has held up a sign, and I noticed that some people are starting to fall asleep. So we are going to quickly pivot to the last pillar of our discussion, which is smart city. So I am a big believer in the reason smart city initiatives holistically haven't taken off is because we've, as an industry, attacked it from the wrong perspective, right? So when you move away from metro areas, I would argue that no two towns are alike. They might have different economic drivers. They might have different public safety concerns. They might have different governmental services. They might have a lot of tourism. They might have a lot of second home ownership. The point in saying all this is that you have to figure out what problems are you trying to solve before you dive down this rabbit hole, because it can be a rabbit hole. So I guess the question I would ask for the panel, since we only have a few minutes left before we open it up to questions, have you seen any initiatives in New York that have worked, especially in rural parts of New York, and what would you recommend to our audience?
I can start. So within NIPA, we actually started a program a few years ago to upgrade the street lights to LED lights. Those fixtures have the capability of plug-and-play sensors. But once we started rolling those out, we were working with the carriers in the region that couldn't provide a reliable network. So we took a step back and said, okay, would Connectall help us get there? So my team currently is working on putting a program together that is going to look at smart city initiatives. It's going to look at what is needed from an EV chargers infrastructure perspective. It's going to look at anything that's going to come in the pipeline. We call it the digital service offerings, to understand what are the needs of different areas. There's no one definition that I found for smart city. Everyone has different needs. So we need to truly understand what those needs are and how we can help them. So my group is actually working with a number of our customers today just to identify what those needs are. They could be one small package that we can deliver that's common to everyone, but there has to be an option for a la carte menu where you can pick and choose what is something that you're looking to address. So I know it's a little mix and it's not as efficient as it's supposed to be, but that's where we are because everyone has different needs. So
I'm gonna pivot a little bit. I would call it smart city, but it's not the traditional definition of smart city. Digital equity and inclusion. The best example I have is a project that the Westchester County Association, which I'm on the board of, which is a business organization. We put together a group which sought and received a U.S. Ignite National Science Foundation grant, Overcome grant. Also included some funding from Schmidt Futures. And our focus there really was, and it ties into Smart City because the city of Yonkers, they had a huge budget they were about to procure from a lot of police, fire, Smart City solutions. And we tacked on, through various grant funding and partners, a whole ecosystem that we're building called the Y Zone. And our goal there is we're using CBRS, we're piloting it. We tacked it on. We're going to experiment with it and see what it does. You know, maybe it has smart city solutions that are more traditional in nature in terms of, you know, kind of the constituencies. But our focus has been onboarding people to the internet and dealing with some of our partners with device ownership, digital literacy education. And that's really making a difference, I think, in a place like the city of Yonkers. So, you know, we talk a lot about rural and underserved and unserved. I mean, there is a huge population that is underserved in the truest sense of the word, and we can't forget about the need to focus on that as part of any of these solutions.
So I'll just talk a little bit about our system, but the Climate Leadership, Climate Protection Act was signed into law again by Governor Cuomo, which sets some pretty stringent goals for clean energy in 2030 and 2040. So decarbonization by 2040, 100% all clean fuels. We're going to be totally carbon-free by then with our energy. 2030, all of our energy production is supposed to be clean, meaning no carbon, no natural gas. So by 24, no longer can you install a natural gas furnace. Things are going to change, and the Climate Action Council is meeting now to try to decide how we're going to meet these goals, and I think they're going to be very difficult to meet personally. But one of the things that we've done over the years is we have aggregated our hot water heaters. We turn them on, we turn them off when our load starts to peak. We are a winter peaker, so we have a lot of electric baseboard heat. So in the winter, we try to shut off our hot water heaters until our peak subsides. I see us, as we partner with the Power Authority, getting into Nest thermostats. I think a lot of Nest thermostats where they have AI capability, where I think we'll learn to turn some of the baseboard electric off in order to, again, control our peak demand. I still think the cheapest kilowatt hour to generate is the one you save. So I think those are a couple of things that we're doing. We've already started to install Nest thermostats in our system. But the aggregation of hot water heater, DERs, distributed energy resources, which means that if the New York ISO calls for power and we shut off all the hot water heaters, we actually could aggregate those hot water heaters and get paid from the New York ISO for turning off all those hot water heaters in our community. So there's money to be made out there if you're able to control your load. And any community could do this. I mean, it's something else you can, you know, consider as part of your broadband if you have the ability to control the smart city. And the other thing, obviously, that kind of keeps me up at night is how are we going to charge all the electric cars? Hurricane's coming, everybody wants to top off their electric car, we're going to have a problem. So again, that's probably, in my mind, one of the biggest drivers in us wanting to have robust fiber connections to every home so that we can control the load and the demand.
Well, that's why you get paid the big bucks, Bill. So we have run out of time. I wish we had more time to dive further into utility poles and smart city initiatives, because I had a little thing I was going to do there, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So does anyone have any questions for our panel?
So I thought it was a really interesting discussion, and it's more of a comment than a question. I like where this was going because this was an and conversation, right? We have fiber, and we need to layer applications on top, smart city, wireless services. And I think what's so unique about this Project Connect, this 8-county project, is that it's just so diverse in its needs. And we need to be looking at every single model and every single angle and attacking this. And I think one of the reasons why today has been so interesting is because you have so many people came from around the country and from around the region to start tackling these issues in earnest and move this forward. So thank you for an interesting discussion. And I did enjoy the part about the utility pole. It was a lot of fun.
Can I go next? Sorry. Hi, I'm with New York Farm Bureau, and I just wanted to ask more of your opinion on when it comes to farmers having access. I mean, certainly, just like everybody else, any other business, need more access to the internet and filling out forms, running a business pretty much. And there are a lot of farms are located in maybe urban areas more now often or just outside of town, but there's still a lot out in the rural countryside, and they they don't have the access they need, and they're that last mile. When you guys were talking about whether it's fiber or wireless, what do you think are some of the solutions to some of those barriers that farmers are facing?
Short answer, I mean, I think precision agriculture, which is part of the 5G funding that we hope to get to at some point, can be part of that conversation. Again, that's going to take fiber and wireless in terms of the actual modality, but ultimately, I think that's going to be an important part. And large parts of New York are inclusive, obviously, of that goal.
The other thing I'll add on is, funding from a middle mile perspective is definitely an option that the counties can look at, because it's hard to justify the cost to build fiber to the home if you have two homes in a mile, but that's the reality. and the commercial carriers today, whether it's fiber, whether it's wired or wireless, they don't have a business case because there's no population out there. So that's the truth. But there are definitely funding opportunities that are coming in the pipeline that can help address those. But from a Connect All perspective, we're looking at completely unserved. If there are regions that you're aware of, let us know. We can work with the Empire State Development Connect All office to help prioritize those.
It's just that we plan to run a fiber to every electric meter in our system. So if you have a farm and you have an electric meter, you'll be connected. That's my perspective.
So this is I'm over here actually. This is a question back to you, Ollie, and maybe picking up off the last question. NIPA owns a lot of territory that cuts across New York State now. It also comes down into the Finger Lakes. Is there any development that will be happening with, say, infrastructure that combines this access that may be alluded to in the last question?
So the short answer is yes. If you look at NIPA's transmission infrastructure, we form the backbone from an electric perspective. But when it comes to communications, it's similar. That's what we call our program Comms Backbone, because we are building that backbone infrastructure. Currently, we're working on a project with Town of Nichols, where NIPA's infrastructure is nowhere close. But we are looking at opportunities on public-private partnerships, whether it's First Light, whether it's Southern Tier Network, partnering with others to get the connectivity back to our backbone. So yes, we are looking at that options. There's access fiber that I mentioned, that's part of our legislation now, being a state authority that we had to go through. But yes, we can make that available to any county, anyone that is in need of using our infrastructure at no cost.
So this will be the long pole in the tent, but I won't make it too long to keep us from the alcohol. On a project where there were 5 pole owners.
Do you need some of that before you ask your question?
No, I'm Irish. I'm Irish. If I had, I'd never lose the microphone. You'd never get me down. So I got to land the plane, okay? The 5 owners, so the provider had access. There was a utility. The utility had poles that were built for REA, so they went through private property. The carrier, the telephone carrier, had poles. And then there were 2 co-ops, and one of the co-ops fought at first for make-ready, because if they allowed that, they would allow commercial connectivity, meaning pass-through. But the minute that fiber, and this was a mid-mile fiber type project with drops, that made it, what do they call it? Not commercial, but I guess it's residential, not even that. But the bottom line was, their board said, oh, we don't, because the minute they opened up that meant anybody else coming down the road would detach. And there were some laws coming around, but how do you get that? They finally did understand that for their own subscribers, they should do it, but it still left them vulnerable, that the next guy coming down the road says, well, you let them do it, you let me do it. And do you see, I mean, there's got to be some ruling that says, okay, you get an exclusive agreement until, I mean, do you see that happening, or you see those kind of roadblocks in some of these projects?
I don't, but there are physical constraints as to what you can put on the pole. But there's also additional hardware that you can purchase to make it more readily accessible. But once you take the federal money, you're subject to the federal rules, and that's what happened with the co-ops. They took the federal money for Make Ready, and they opened themselves up to anybody that could attach to their pole, which I should kick it over to Chris, but I do think that there's a precedent where I think they have to allow them on their poles anyway, so kind of a moot point.
I have seen that issue, though, create some difficulty in projects, and particularly in wireless, and this is a little bit more in some dense suburban areas, but we've had situations where we want to provide service in a community that's a private community with private roads. There may be an easement for utilities. Like I said to start, I'm a wireless guy, so I'll tell you, I pull out the easement, and if it says telecommunications, I say included. But that's not a practical answer when you're trying to build something out. But in one case, which we had actually on Long Island just recently, we were doing a 30-something node network in a suburban area. We had a plan to do 5 in a private community, and we had to pull those out. And the short answer is we worked with the community to resolve it, but it meant that a couple of poles weren't 40-footers, they were 60-footers in order to get the service into that area. So, you know, it's an interesting community question, but from a legal point of view, yeah, that can be a barrier.
Jeff, this is going to be our last question.
Oh, I'm sorry, but
Cut me off.
we've run out of time.
You've run out of time. I have a 4-part question about polls. If you could address that first, Jeff. Yeah. No.
There's always one.
Stand up. All right. So Jeff, kidding aside, I do have a question for you because you brought up oversight initially, and I think there's a general concern amongst most providers of we're kind of guessing at what these projects might cost, and you said yourself you ran out of money on one. So that there's supply chain problems, labor shortages, inflation's happening. The real money, as you know, hasn't even come yet. I mean, we're a long way from this $42 billion infrastructure coming yet. So what would your suggestion be then for oversight to make sure that you're not underwater before you start? Is that a state commission of some sort, or is it a third-party provider, or an industry group like this? What would you suggest?
Well, one thing I will say is that we're fortunate this time around where oversight is not the sole responsibility of NTIA. One of the smart things they've done with this whole program is to push the money down to the states where they're now the grantee, and then they can grant out this money to sub-grantees. So it puts the onus on the states. So I think, from my perspective, I think the states where you're going to see, where you should see efficiencies and really good oversight are those states that already have a broadband deployment fund in place. So they have had practice, they have been through this, they're in a better position to not only grant out the money, but they also understand where their pain points are in the state, or at least I would hope they would understand all this. And so I think those states that already have a broadband deployment fund and obviously a broadband office are ahead of the game, because the oversight is going to have to come from the state. So my recommendation, before I get to the recommendation, I would say the other thing that concerns me a little bit is NTIA has to hire 50 some odd people to work as liaisons with all the states as well as territories. And of course the states have to hire people, right, to build these broadband offices up. They can't, some of the states that have existing broadband offices can't rely on existing staff. That's not enough. So where are they going to find these people? So I'm a little concerned about that. But I think in general, and I'm hopeful that because oversight now has been pushed down to the state level, that we won't run into the same issues we ran into in the past. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but it really is going to have to come from state leadership, and by the way, in partnership with regions and with local communities, which I think some of my own state of Colorado. The one thing I'll say about Colorado, if you want to go and look at some really good regional examples, go to Colorado. Go look at the Northwest Council of Governments. They just published a sort of a historical perspective on where they started and where they're at today with their regional collaboration partnership. So I think that's another thing that's going to assist the state governments is the existing partnerships they have in regions. So hopefully, I'm not really familiar with the construct here in New York, but hopefully you have similar partnerships here and in other states if you're here from another state. Because again, oversight's going to come at the state level. So partnerships are going to be key.
You set
So-
me up good for that, Jeff.
Pardon me?
You set me up good for that.
Well, you gave me $20, I had to. So, anyways, please join me in thanking our great panel. It was really a lot of fun being up here. Thank you.